All right, so welcome everyone to another edition of our FutureMakers Coalition conversation about equity and COVID-19. Today we're going to be talking about current issues in higher ed, and I'm really excited about what we're going to share today. And I hope you all will type your questions in the chat and participate as we go. So the first thing we just want to do before we start off is to remind you that we know that talking about issues related to race can be very, very hard. And it actually doesn't matter what your race is. There's trauma associated with racism for all of us. So please do just be mindful of that. Take a few deep breaths. And if you feel yourself being triggered or you feel uncomfortable in any way, shape, or form, bring yourself back to a peaceful place in your mind and know that that is normal and it's okay. We also know it's super hard to be living in a virtual world. I just demonstrated that for you already today with some technical difficulties, but it's okay that you are probably taking care of kids or have pets around, or that UPS might show up at your door. Please be free to feel free to turn off your camera if you need to, though we do love seeing your faces. So if you're willing to have them on, that would be fantastic. So our objectives today are to ensure that we're practicing self-care. We want everybody to be taking really good care of themselves right now during these really difficult times. To get to know FutureMakers a little bit. So we definitely want to share with you a little bit about FutureMakers Coalition and why we're doing this. Explore structural racism through the lens of COVID. We know that COVID-19 has really put a spotlight on a lot of the inequities and challenges that we face in systems throughout our communities. We want to learn a little bit about our own implicit biases and ignite collective action to co-create anti-racist policies and procedures for Southwest Florida. We have a community agreement. This is a brave space. We want you to be open to changing your mind. We want you to be respectful and to be able to hear other people's perspectives. And so let's all agree to have a courageous conversation together. You can't say anything wrong as long as we're following this community agreement. It's an opportunity for us to learn and grow together as a community. So what is FutureMakers? FutureMakers is a collective impact initiative. And we have a big goal. Our goal is to increase the number of working age adults, those are individuals that are aged 25 to 64, our workforce, increase the number of people in our workforce that have a credential beyond high school by the year 2025. We want to get to 55%. We know that by the year 2025, more than 60% of the jobs in the state of Florida will require a credential beyond high school. And so a lot of our community challenges can be tied to our ability to help individuals obtain the education and skills they need to fill in-demand jobs in the region. So far, we've added almost 31,000 credentials since FutureMakers started. Our baseline year is 2013. We started this work together in 2014, and we've added that many credentials, which is amazing and exciting, and is something for us all to be really, really proud of. But when you look at it like this, when you look at it on this graph here, what you see is that even though we're adding thousands and thousands of credentials beyond a high school diploma, we are still pretty much operating on a flat line. The red line is our goal, and we have a lot of work to do in order to meet our goal. But we're running for it, we're not giving up on it. And one of the things that we've noticed as we've dug into this data more deeply is that particularly Black and African American and Hispanic and Latinx students throughout the system and workers are not obtaining the same level of education outcomes as other students, particularly white students. So that's why we're having these conversations, to start to shed light on the issues that we face with regard to equity. So our point of view is that everyone has a right to real opportunity. No matter where you come from, what you look like, or how much money your family has, everyone should have what they need to learn, grow, and thrive. But opportunity is not equal. It depends on where you come from and who you are. When we talk about systems change, which we talk about a lot with FutureMakers, we're talking about the policies, practices, and beliefs rooted in history that are still affecting people today. These keep many Black, Native American, Latinx, and Hispanic people from the education and skills they need. These systems unfairly hold back students who are seeking a better education and better life. We can make opportunity real by taking real action to remove barriers for these students and make education and workplaces work better for everyone. When we ensure real outcomes for every student, we can right the wrongs and achieve just and fair outcomes for all. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. We have Precious Green-Gunter. She's the Director of Equity, Ethics, and Compliance and Title IX Coordinator at FGCU. Precious holds a BS in Human Resource Management from the University of South Carolina and a JD from North Carolina Central University School of Law. She is currently the Director of Equity, Ethics, and Compliance and Title IX Coordinator for Florida Gulf Coast University. She oversees the university's compliance and ethics programs and adheres to state and federal discrimination laws. She chairs multiple committees and is passionate about social justice work and initiatives. Jana Sabo is the Title IX Coordinator, Equity Officer, Human Resource Manager, and Employee Relations for Florida Southwestern State College. Jana holds a bachelor's of arts degree in psychology from Flagler College. She is currently the Title IX Coordinator, Equity Officer, and HR Manager for Employee Relations at Florida Southwestern State College. Jana has served FSW in a number of roles and has been in her current position for 6 years. Jana believes that building a foundation with equity and ethics in mind is the best way to impact change in your community. So I will pass it over to you two.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And Precious and I both really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak with everyone today and share our insights regarding topics in higher education. As you see with both of our titles, we're basically counterparts at the two different institutions, both of us dealing with equity issues, Title IX issues, and really kind of coming from that lens of how do we make things better in our institutions. And so through the session today, we hope to discuss, start off with the statistical data, kind of looking at how things are impacting our area as well as nationally, and kind of going through some of these equity laws, intersectionality, what that looks like for our upcoming fall. And then we'll finish up with the steps that the colleges are taking and what we can do as a community. So on the next slide, as we go into the statistics and we're talking about some of how these statistics change so fast, the next slide shows the US statistics as of July 27th at being 4.2 million cases already. And with the total deaths being 146,546. So these statistics change very quickly, as you'll see on the next slide when we talk about Southwest Florida statistics. Those statistics were taken just 3 days before, and we hadn't hit that 4 million case mark yet. So you can really kind of get bogged down sometimes in the data and the statistics. It's hard to know what's, sometimes we pay attention to the percentages of occupancy in the hospitals. Sometimes we're paying attention to how many new cases there are versus death rates. So it can really be overwhelming with a lot of the data out there. So in this slide, I wanted to take the opportunity to kind of break down what we were seeing in our 5-county service area. So when I talk about the 5 counties, I'm talking about Charlotte, Lee, Collier, Hendry, and Glades. As far as what the numbers look like, and this was as of last Friday, July 24th. So when we look at the breakdown in the white population, Hispanic population, and Black population as far as our total cases. Now, if you're doing some quick math, you might see they might not add up, but some people have multiple, either an ethnicity and race claimed. Some people didn't have anything claimed. But one of the significance that we're seeing also is we're seeing a reduction in the average age. So now we're looking at late 30s to early 40s, whereas 2 months ago we were looking at the average age being more in the 50s to 60s as far as the cases as well as the death rates. So what that's doing now, and the reason I think it's very significant for our populations, is now that the average age is coming down to the 30s or 40s, we're talking about parents who might have school-age children in the K through 12 system. We're talking about people who might be students themselves. So we're not talking about that statistically, the traditional older age, population we were initially talking about back in March and April. This is something that is coming down in age and really having much more impact on multiple areas in our communities. On the next slide, we look into some of the statistics regarding the specific race and ethnicity demographics, looking at the differences. When you look at the rates of Black Americans who are dying as a result of COVID-19, you're looking at a rate of about 2.3 times the rate of white and Asian Americans who actually have the lowest rates. And even when you're looking at your Hispanic, your Latinx Americans, the Black Americans are still dying at 2 times the rate as our Hispanic and Latin Americans are. And when you look at, if you were to take those statistics and turn it to where we would be looking at the same rates as whites, then you would have 17,000 Black people who would still be alive, 3,000 Latinos that would still be alive. So looking at those statistics, it can be really sobering to see how this inequitably impacts these different groups of people. As we go to the next slide and we start to think about how this looks in higher education, Precious will talk a little bit more about what we're doing specifically at the institutions, but colleges and universities, we have to still be open. We can't all shut down. Just like the rest of the country, we can't shut down all of our businesses. And but then again, we also can't go back to things being normal. So we're kind of in this ever-changing world of, and I've heard that there may even be some changes next week coming out of the governor's office as far as what's being dictated for the K through 12 systems as well as for higher ed. So even though we might even think we've got it figured out for this time being, there could be something that changes a week from now that turns everything on its head, and now we've got to scramble and kind of try to figure this out again. But it's really difficult for the institutions to find that balance of how do you provide a quality education, but then still keeping people safe. I myself have had a student doing college classes that went remote and a student doing middle school classes that both went remote. They both had a good deal of struggles, and was the quality of their education the same as it would have been in the classroom? I definitely watched my younger child as he's finishing up middle school, really not having those hands-on experiences in the laboratories. His STEM class was very different. Some of those things we weren't really prepared to be able to teach those online, especially when you're talking about those hands-on type of labs and things that they get to do. So the learning was very different and it was changed very quickly. And so now we have to think about going forward, what changes are we permanently going to make, and then what things that we tried to do in March and April can we now do better come August and September, now that we've had some time to live with this a little bit and think of some different ideas. And thinking about another student I've been working with specifically when we talk about the different factors beyond just COVID-19 that have been impacting our students. I started working with a student back in March. She was a first-generation student, and she'd been using a lot of our mental health services, been utilizing our food pantry, our case management, office. So she was really well connected with getting some great support and resources on campus. And then all of a sudden spring break hit. And then we didn't bring the students back to campus, and we moved all of their classes online. And then we had to close down some of those services. Our food pantry had to close for a little while. Our case management people weren't as available. The counseling appointments were only available via Zoom and not face-to-face. And then couple that with doing the classes online, the students started to feel a little more disconnected than she did previously. And so she started reaching out for some assistance, especially once the murder of George Floyd happened, because she had grown to rely on social media over this time. That was her connection to the world. And then when the murder happened, it became very difficult. She was just bombarded with so many different messages and so much hate that was out there. And she really felt exhausted by social media that she decided that she needed to take a step back and unplug from social media for a period of time. So again, she's reaching out because now all of her in-person services are gone and they switched to remote. And now she's removing herself from the remote environment because that's too stressful for her. So you really get these compounding factors that keep adding stress to these students' plates. Never mind, she's trying to finish up her college classes and make sure that she gets credit for the courses. So it's just been a really difficult thing to balance, in that as people tend to become more isolated, some are getting more and more isolated, you know, in those negative ways. And I know Precious will talk about some of the mental health issues and things like that. But on the next slide, when we talk about some of those challenges that we are going to face on campus, or we're currently facing on campus, we have a lot of students who are afraid to come to campus. We have a lot of staff and faculty who are afraid to come back to campus and work in person. But then we also have those who have no fear of the virus at all and are demanding that we have in-person classes and in-person services. So us trying to learn how to balance those pieces, how do we be all things to all people? That's something the colleges have really had to work hard on over the last couple of months. I don't know that we've got it all figured out yet. You know, I think we've got to figure it out today. It's working today. But come a week from now, or come 3 weeks from now, when our classes start again, we're not really sure what it's going to look like. We can try to do the best we can in the moment, and hopefully come up with some good plans going forward. And then when you add in the social justice issues on top of that, higher education, colleges and universities, it's usually a great opportunity for students to start to find their voice. You have students on both sides of these issues. And then you've got this group of students who fall somewhere in between. So you have people who are very passionate in one direction, very passionate in another direction. And then this whole group that, you know, yes, they support Black Lives Matter, but they also support other initiatives. And so they kind of feel like if they're not on one side or the other, then where do they really fit at all? And that can cause a lot of internal trauma and some unrest and uneasy feelings in those students as well. In college and university systems, we really try to make sure that we give everybody their space to be heard, but we also have to be careful that we're not violating anybody's rights. We're also maintaining respectful and productive educational environments. It's kind of like a lot of juggling of a lot of different balls. And then now, because the social justice issues are kind of front and center, I think we feel like we're juggling even more of those balls and trying to figure out how to navigate all of these pieces. So on the next slide, when we talk about what laws are involved, the next one talks about Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So on the next slide, you'll see that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin in any program or activity that receives federal funds or federal financial assistance. This is one of the areas that Precious and I cover very much. We're kind of the alphabet soup of titles. You know, we've got Title VI, Title VII, Title IX, Title II, you name it. If it's a title, it's handled in our offices. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about Title II and the Americans with Disabilities Act. So this is our folks who have some sort of disability, whether they have a classroom accommodation for extended time, maybe they have an interpreter or a scribe. It's some sort of accommodation that is needed in order to be able to level the playing field on the basis of a disability. So when you couple all of these things together and you move all of your classes online, sometimes those things become a little bit different. Imagine yourself as a hearing impaired student who is used to lip reading with a professor in the classroom, and now all of a sudden all of your professors are wearing masks and covering their faces. So if you were the student that used to be able to rely on lip reading, well, now maybe you have to rely on an interpreter. And that's a very different skill set when you're talking about utilizing those different accommodations. If a student's classes switch to all online and they're all remote, if they have a scribe who takes notes for them in the class, sometimes that can be a little more challenging because now you're having to add that extra person in. And again, going back to the interpreter, imagine on these Zoom meetings, trying to follow your professor as they're speaking, but then also trying to follow the interpreter when you've got all of these little tiny boxes on your screen. So these present lots of different challenges, and trying to make sure that we balance everything. This change, a lot of the accommodations don't translate exactly over to a remote environment. And so we've had to be very thoughtful and very deliberate and creative with how we make sure that we are accommodating all of these groups. I know in some of our counties we encounter, and this does impact other certain race and ethnic populations more than others, but we do have certain areas in Hendry and Glades County where they don't actually have access to internet in their homes. I actually had an employee that I was working with one of our campuses who was supposed to be doing some remote work at home, and we had to provide her with a hotspot so that she was able to do the work, because the CenturyLink or whoever it is in that area doesn't actually come out to where she lives. So for me, having the privilege that I've had all my life, that really didn't cross my mind as being one of those barriers. And fortunately, she spoke up and was courageous enough to say, hey, I need this help. This, isn't available in my area. What can we do? We were able to be a little bit more creative than we've been in the past, and we were able to get it worked out. But on the next slide, the last part of the law part that I'll talk about is Title IX of the Education Amendments Act of 1972. So basically it says that the colleges and K through 12 systems cannot discriminate based on sex and gender in anything that we do. It's been around for years and years. We're all very familiar with it. It talks about equity in athletics. It talks about making sure that we're not discriminating against victims of violent acts. However, the U.S. Department of Education decided that the beginning of May would be a great time to release over 2,000 pages of new regulation regarding Title IX, and that we needed to have it implemented and ready to go by August 14th. So 2,080 plus pages, about 2 months to implement, and of course there's no funding guidelines or anything additional funding to go along with it. So to think about the things that Precious and I have had to deal with, working under all of these constraints with trying to juggle all of these other pieces, now you throw in a major piece of federal regulation that we have to be in compliance with by a date that's just around the corner, and it kind of throws another wrinkle into all of the things that we get to handle. And with that, on the next slide, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Precious so she can kind of go into some more of those details.
So thank you, Jana, and thank you, Tessa, for including us and allowing us to present on this topic today. So, you probably are wondering now, how do all of these things overlap? What does COVID, what does EO laws, how do all of these things connect? And so here we have some different images that just show, current representation in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, the current questions that are being posed now in terms of people feeling as though their rights are being violated by being required to wear masks and other safety guidelines that are in place. And then also social media as well, being linked into all of this because students and employees are bombarded with all of this information daily on social media, online, just everywhere they look. And so next slide, one of the important things to first talk about is intersectionality and what that means. And so that's a framework for understanding how an aspect of a person's social and political identities might combine to create unique modes of discrimination and privilege. So when I think about or talk about myself, I am an African-American female. And so, you know, both of those groups are groups that have been marginalized and experienced discrimination for hundreds of years in this country. And so oftentimes whenever being faced with oppression or discrimination, when you have multiple social and personal identities that intertwine, sometimes it's hard to distinguish why you're being discriminated against. So, you know, am I receiving this treatment because I am Black? Am I receiving this treatment because I am a woman? Am I receiving this treatment because I am overweight? You know, you take into account all of these different social identities to try to figure out what it is that is causing this specific behavior. And a lot of times it's not easy to do in terms of trying to figure out what is the impetus for someone's bias. Next slide. So how will students and employees be impacted with having to deal with the overlap of all of these different issues as they're coming into the education system in the fall? And, you know, today we're focusing on higher education because that's our area of expertise. But, you know, it's important to note too that of course this is also having a huge impact on the K through 12 system as well. Next slide. So one of the first topics, and I'm pointing out about 4 to 5 different major concerns here in terms of returning in the fall. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list. I'm just pulling out kind of the primary things that we've been seeing. So mental health concerns. When we look at statistics, approximately 40 million people over the age of 18 experience anxiety in the United States. There's a lot of data, a lot of information out there and news stories that have been covering the fact that this anxiety has increased since COVID-19. And of course, this 40 million people are people that have actually reported or received treatment for having some sort of anxiety. So you can imagine that that number is probably higher in terms of people that actually haven't even sought out treatment for anxiety. And one of the things to note is that a lot of times, especially within minority communities, especially the African-American and Black communities, oftentimes they don't believe in seeking out treatment for mental health and mental illness. So I can assure you that if you probably broke these numbers down even more, you would not see a lot of representation of minority communities because oftentimes they don't seek treatment when it comes down to mental health concerns. And I'm going to talk about why that is in a little bit. Also in terms of elderly population, so concerns regarding, you know, we live in a very, when we look at the Southwest Florida area in the region that we live in, we know that this area is heavily populated with elderly community. And so there's been a lot of concern regarding having college campuses in this area and what type of impact and effect that could have on the members of our community in terms of spreading COVID-19. So there are those concerns. And then also there's been a lot of data surrounding pre-existing conditions. So that if a person has pre-existing conditions, then they have a higher increased chance of contracting COVID-19. And then at the same time, we've seen a lot of legislation and a lot of rollbacks that have been occurring from the administration, I mean the US administration, in the midst of this pandemic. And so one of the hot topics that has taken place since President Trump took office is rolling back the Affordable Care Act. And so a huge provision in that was coverage for pre-existing conditions. And so there's even the concern that, let's say they do take some type of action on healthcare, that then people that have pre-existing conditions could lose some type of coverage that they would have had, you know, in the midst of the pandemic as well. And then race relations. And of course, this is not, you know, it's last on this list, but it's certainly not in terms of importance. So we have to consider race relations as well. And so you have legitimate concerns and fear for safety. So in the midst of the pandemic, we've seen protests that have occurred. We've seen minority groups and allies in support of the protests being blamed for the increased spread of coronavirus. So around the Memorial Day weekend and in June, when we had a lot of the increase after the George Floyd shootings, we had a lot more protests that were taking place. And so there was a large argument that, you know, that was what caused this increase or this surge in cases that we've been seeing over the past month. But actually, if you look at, you know, information that was being circulated long before the George Floyd shooting, it was always predicted that once we hit or July that there was going to be another spike in terms of cases of coronavirus. And so you have a lot of legitimate concerns. There's a lot of things being posted on social media targeted towards minority groups in terms of, you know, that they deserve to die, wanting to kill them, racial slurs being hurled towards them. And so students have a legitimate fear in terms of returning to campus and whether or not they're going to be safe, not just in terms of coronavirus, but also safe, you know, to be who they are in terms of their race and be protected in the environment that they're in. And then also racial disparities in healthcare. Next slide. So racial disparities in healthcare is very important because we, as Jana already pointed out, we see that minority populations, especially the Black and African American population, has been affected by COVID at increasingly higher rates than other groups. And so there's a lot of different reasons when we talk about health and equity consideration in racial and ethnic minority groups and why there are health concerns. And so this information is information that I pulled from the CDC website. They actually have a really good page on there that kind of highlights a lot of the disparities and information and data concerning coronavirus, as well as breaking it down based on race, et cetera. And so the factors that contribute to increased risk when we're talking about equity considerations for health, of course, discrimination. So there's systemic discrimination that exists not just across healthcare, but in all facets of programs throughout the United States. So we know in terms of housing, in terms of education, the criminal justice system, finance, all of those different areas, we know that those things contribute to concerns. And then in terms of healthcare access and utilization, you know, there's a lot of reasons why minority communities, especially Black communities, don't have access to the healthcare system at the same rates as their white counterparts. And so there's a lot of different reasons for that. You know, some of that is employment and the types of jobs that they work. Oftentimes they may end up working jobs that don't have great healthcare benefits and great access to healthcare. And so they're not able to actually seek treatment. Another issue is lack of trust. You know, there's been things over history in terms of like the syphilis experiment. So a lot of Blacks and African Americans do not trust the government or trust the the healthcare system, because they're fearful that they can be harmed or that they would be used as essentially lab rats in experiments, you know, because it has happened previously to them in more than one situation. Occupation, so a lot of individuals of minority groups, they work in occupations that are considered essential employment. So they work in the grocery stores, they work our farms, they work in healthcare facilities. And so because of that, they have a greater risk of being, you know, coming in contact with coronavirus because they're more exposed to the public, and they're not as privileged as we are in having the opportunities to work from home and isolate ourselves, you know, so they are at greater risk because of their financial situation and because of systemic discrimination and issues that have been in place, they have no choice but to continue to work and expose themselves in these situations. And then education, income, and wealth gaps. So same thing, you know, this is really definitely tied to the work of FutureMakers and everything that Tessa just talked about in terms of, you know, lower diploma rates for minority communities, lower education, lower income, and then we see these gaps in wealth. And so again, all of those things have an impact on their access to healthcare. And then lastly, housing. So housing is important as well because oftentimes marginalized groups and communities, they live in housing situations where it's overcrowded. And then culturally, a lot of different minority groups, they are known to have multiple generations all reside within one household. And so again, they have a higher exposure. And a lot of times, again, because of income disparities or housing disparities, they end up living in areas that are extremely highly populated where they're in, you know, buildings with multiple people, hundreds of people. And so because of that, they have an increased risk to exposure. Next slide. So income disparities and need to work is just another thing that's going to impact students and employees as they return in the fall. We've seen layoffs occurring, furloughs, bankruptcies and closings of small businesses and even some major corporations, reduced hours. So we're seeing scenarios where people's hours have been reduced, but maybe they still don't qualify for unemployment income to help supplement that. And then so reduced income as a result of reduced hours. And then in some instances, we're seeing reduced income, but not reduced hours. So some organizations have required employees to just take pay cuts. You know, they just do the 10% pay cut across the board, but it still expects you to work your 40-hour work week. So there's just a lot of different ways that this is impacting our communities as they are preparing to come back in the fall. And one of the things is that, especially when you look at our students in our Southwest Florida population, a lot of them receive Pell Grants, which means in terms of income and the background where they're coming from and coming to school, that their parents or whoever their guardians are, that they don't have a substantial income to begin with. And so, you know, this can have not only an impact on the student, but a familial impact, because you don't necessarily know to what extent that student's income also helps to contribute to the overall family household income. And so, or the reverse of that, meaning that because of maybe their parents or whomever have lost their job or reduced hours or income, that they need the student to actually work to help supplement some of the income, some of the expenses that they may incur as a result of losing their income or having reduced hours or their business closing and things of that nature. So this is just very important because a large percentage of our students work. And by them having to work and trying to figure out their safety procedures and precautions as they go into the workplace, as well as trying to figure out how that will affect their personal and familial dynamics going forward. Next slide. So here's just another chart that I pulled from the US Census Bureau that just breaks down income disparities. I think if you've done any type of work in this area, or you've even just done any type of research, it's very well known in terms of income disparities amongst Blacks and African Americans when compared to other racial groups here in the United States. And so this chart demonstrates that over the past 50 years. And so we can see here that in 2018, the most recent data that we have, we see that for Blacks, the average income, the median income, was $41,000. And so when we look at Asians, we see that their income is double in terms of that. And then when we look at their white counterparts, it's almost double as well. So there is a huge, huge income disparity in this country when it comes down to Blacks and African Americans. And again, Hispanics as well, certainly not to leave them out. They're almost at 100% as well in terms of the difference in income between them and between the white and the Asian population within the US. And so this again just further evidences the impact of systemic discrimination that has occurred in this country for a very long time, and how all of this plays into just a lot of different systems and structures. Next slide. So another big thing is class and work accommodations. So, students and employees are being given opportunities to bring forward complaints and concerns regarding accommodations for their class. And I'm going to talk about how those things are being handled in a little bit. And also technology concerns. So Jana already touched on that a little bit when talking about the employee that she's had to assist with Wi-Fi and things of that nature. And we're seeing the same thing with students in K through 12, where a lot of students that were sent home to do remote learning, the schools had to come up with ways to provide them with access to Wi-Fi in their area. I know I'm from South Carolina, but in South Carolina, they used buses to send out to certain areas that had Wi-Fi on the buses, just to make sure the entire area or neighborhood would be able to access Wi-Fi. So we're seeing that happen across the country in terms of trying to figure out how to assist people that have all of these different needs in accommodating to this kind of virtual learning environment that learning and working environment that we're all being exposed to. The next thing would be adapting to new learning, teaching, and working environment. And so Tessa touched on that a little bit at the beginning, and saying that, we're all getting used to this kind of virtual environment, and even giving a disclaimer regarding people and their pets and their kids at the beginning, because again, this is becoming our new normal. But what we have to take into consideration is, how does that impact learning? Because everyone doesn't learn virtually. And so what type of gaps are we going to see in the future as a result of students having to be exposed to learning in a virtual environment, if that's not the way that they best thrive? I know personally, I am not a virtual learner. If I had to take all my classes online, I think that would be something that I certainly would not sign up for. So it just really depends. And so we have to think about the impact that it's going to have on people. And then family concerns. So, children, childcare, there's a lot of conversation around daycare. So if you're an employee and you have to work, you know, what do you do with your kids? Or you have to make a decision. Do you want to send them to school? Do you want to send them to daycare? If you are a student, or maybe you live with an elderly grandparent, or you live with a family member that has some type of pre-existing medical condition, you have concerns about, if I come back on campus in the fall, then, you know, am I putting my grandparent, or am I putting my family member or loved one or friend or whomever at risk because I am returning back to campus? Next slide. And then protests and race relations. And I already talked about this to some extent. And so we're seeing that as well across college campuses. And what you see here are some images of, in June on FGCU's campus, shortly after George Floyd's shooting, our students held a protest on campus in the middle of the summer, in the middle of a pandemic. They decided to hold a protest because these issues are very important and they felt like they needed to be addressed. And these are some of the pictures and images from that protest that took place on campus. And so it's certainly not unique to FGCU. We're seeing this across the board at a lot of campuses. And so in addition to developing and coming up with COVID plans on returning to universities, another thing that universities and colleges are doing is also planning, you know, doing equity programming. So how are we coming up with not just COVID plans as well, but equity plans as we return to in the fall? Next slide. So how are these concerns being addressed? So all of these different areas that I just highlighted in terms of mental illness, income disparities, race relations, protests, what types of things, accommodations, what types of things are the universities and colleges doing to address these concerns? Next slide. So in terms of mental health, you know, one of the big things that has certainly grown in the midst of all of this is virtual counseling. A lot of the universities and colleges have extended to offering virtual counseling options to their students, you know, in a more extended platform or format than it existed before. I certainly did know and interact with students before COVID that did already attend virtual counseling, but now it's something that is, you know, being even more, being offered even more on campuses. Another popular thing is something that's called the crisis text line. And so that's a text line where someone can send in a text if they're in the middle of a crisis. And when I was looking up some research regarding them, 1 in 5 texts that they have received since the pandemic started has mentioned the word virus. So they're seeing an increase in texts that are related to concerns regarding coronavirus. Some other ones are BetterHelp and then Talkspace. So these are all kind of platforms that since the pandemic has started, they're seeing a huge increase in terms of enrollment and members and people that are using these services. In addition, the federal government has also taken some steps to address these as well. So Medicare expanded telehealth service coverage in terms of their benefits. Recently, we had the same thing in the state of Florida. The governor of the state of Florida expanded our coverage to include telehealth services as well, to cover us from here through the end until the next enrollment period. The DEA has also relaxed e-prescriptions of controlled substances. So again, another way for people to still have access to their medications and to try to treat some of the mental health concerns that we're seeing in a lot of our communities. And then another thing that's just very important to notate here is when we're talking about chatbots versus doctors. So there's also been this rise in chatbots are literally like texting services. So you may not necessarily be communicating with someone that is a licensed therapist or a licensed doctor. And so it's very important to make sure that, you know, whichever site you're using, that you're using one that actually has licensed doctors or licensed therapists, as opposed to just texting back and forth with an automated system, if you will. So that's something that's very important because a lot of these companies are touting themselves as reputable counseling services, and they're not. So it's important for people to make sure that they're distinguishing between those when trying to figure out what type of virtual service, you know, counseling they would like to use. Next slide. So in terms of safety measures, you know, we certainly have the CDC guidelines that are in place and that, you know, we're asking people to adhere to. But then a lot of campuses, as I mentioned, they've been having to develop COVID-19 plans or COVID-19 return plans or K through 12 return plans. And so those plans are highlighting a number of things. I didn't include everything. You know, the one that FGCU prepared was, I want to say, about 25 to 30 pages. I'm not sure how FSWs look, but I mean, it includes a lot of information. So just highlighting some of those things in there, you know, of course, social distancing requirements, mask requirements, so requiring people to wear masks at all times when they're on campus, even when they're in classrooms, capacity limits, so limiting the number of people to rooms. And so at FGCU, they are cutting that down to 50% capacity for the rooms. And I was talking to someone who, one of my friends here, she's a 5th grade teacher. And I was talking to her, and she teaches at, oh gosh, I forgot the name of her school, but it's Sunshine in Lehigh. And so she was talking about her classroom, and her class is already pretty big. She normally has between 30 to 40 students in her class. And by the social distancing guidelines and requirements of how they have to organize the desk in the classroom, she was saying that at most she would only be able to have 10 to 12 students physically in her class. And then they've also required them to actually serve lunch. And then these were their requirements as of 2 weeks ago from what she told me. But they're also required to serve lunch and everything in the classroom. And I was like, you know, that's going to be a lot in terms of managing, you know, I remember when I was in school, we couldn't even chew gum in class. So, you know, you imagine students eating breakfast and lunch in the classroom, and, you know, you're just all types of issues that will have to come from that. So limitations on events. So, you know, we have decreased the amount of events that will be occurring on campus, and then the ones that are occurring, limitations on who has access to campus. So, you know, we're a public campus, but trying to limit events on campus from outside organizations and groups for now due to safety concerns and, you know, measures that are in place. Housing restrictions. So, you know, we have residential housing on campus. So how are these individuals going to be allowed to, you know, coexist in these spaces, limiting them to single rooms, making it where only one person is in each room. And then what type of requirements are they going to have in place within the residence halls? And then the other thing is accommodations requests. So of course, faculty and staff that have any concerns can submit accommodations requests the same way that they normally would under Title II through our Section 504 through their university or college procedures. And so those accommodations requests can range from a myriad of things, but it can be that, you know, I have asthma, so I can't wear a mask, you know, 24/7, or I have concerns about coming and taking my classes in person, so I need to take my class virtual. Or if you're a professor, I have a pre-existing condition, I have a higher chance of being exposed, or I have higher chance of dying or suffering major illness as a result of being exposed. And so therefore I need to be able to teach my class remotely. And so there are processes that are in place at, you know, both at colleges and universities so that students and teachers and professors and staff can submit these accommodations requests so that they don't have to return physically on campus in the fall if they have, you know, a serious health concern. Next slide. Another important thing to address, so kind of the income disparities and the talk that I just was giving in terms of work and needing to work, something that's very important that was rolled out as well. Most of the people in terms of the stimulus package were concerned about the checks that were coming to individuals, but also included in that was also monies that were sent to institutes of higher education. So there was $14 billion that was allocated to go to post-secondary institutions. And so those monies have been dispersed thus far. And so they are able to go to course materials, technology, housing, food, healthcare, and childcare. So this is only for students. And so students can actually apply for COVID CARES fundings from their universities to reimburse them for any of those things that they have suffered as a result. So if you lived in an apartment and you lost housing, or you're behind on your rent, or et cetera, because you lost your job as a result of COVID, then you can submit and apply for these CARES fundings to supplement some of the income and monies that they've lost. And they are given out in the form of actual cash grants. And every university, the university makes a decision on who they give the monies to, but every university also has to certify that those funds were used specifically for that purpose to be given to students. And it's not in the form of a scholarship or anything like that. It is actually in cash payment that they have given the monies to the student. They have to do a certification, and every 45 days, their website, so if you log on any university or college's website at the moment, there should be, if they're compliant, there should be a tab or information on the Department of Education COVID CARES funding, and they are supposed to update how much they received and how much they have dispersed thus far. And it's supposed to be updated every 45 days. So if you go on FGCU's website right now, there's a big red button that you can click on that takes you to that site, tells you how to apply for funding, tells you what the current balance is that they have left, and how much money they dispersed thus far. So it's very important for students to know that there is at least this sort of funding out there, because there was a lot of conversation, a lot of people upset regarding the stimulus money that went out, because a lot of college students were exempted from those funds because if they were claimed by their parents and they weren't eligible for the individual stimulus checks that went out. So if they're in college, then they did also still have at least this option to apply for funding if they needed it. Next slide. And then, so in terms of addressing the racial issues and protests and things of that nature, we're seeing college campuses across the nation implement all types of programming. One of the big things is we're seeing a lot of different task force that are being created. So whether it's task force on anti-racism, task force on race relations, equity committees, we're seeing the appointment of chief diversity officers on these campuses if they didn't already have one, and creation of diversity offices or equity offices, or more robust programming surrounding their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. We are seeing revised mission and value statements. And I'm talking about this in terms of higher education, but it's really not just higher education, right? I mean, we've seen major corporations have been doing the same. We've seen the renaming of products that have had racially offensive names for years, hundreds of years. We're seeing renaming of products. We're seeing rebranding. We're seeing all types of diversity and inclusion websites popping up within organizations and their mission and value statements. So we're seeing that occurring all across the nation. Regulation and policy development. Unfortunately, I can say that I know for certain that there is a county within our 5-county service area that just 2 years ago, for the first time, actually implemented a non-discrimination policy. That for all this time in their K-12 system, they did not actually have a non-discrimination policy, which is just mind-boggling. So the fact that we are just now seeing these types of things take place. Another big thing is equity index scores. So, there's a lot of different organizations, especially for universities, where they can rank them based on, it's a diversity index scoring system. And so universities are aiming to increase their diversity scores or the equity index scores, because these are things that students, when they are applying to colleges now, that are very important to them in making those decisions. And then a lot of mandatory training and education and programming, because of course we know that that's one of the ways that you can start in terms of trying to eradicate systems of discrimination and harassment, by trying to at least educate people on why this behavior or this treatment is wrong in the first place. And of course we know it takes a whole lot more than just trainings, but at minimum, the first thing that you want to do is at least provide the people with the knowledge. So these are just some of the things. Again, there's a lot of things that are being done, but I'm just highlighting some of the main things. Next slide.
And when we talk about the things that the community can do to help, one of the things that came to my mind was part of my job, and part of probably Precious's job as well, is each year we have to do this equity report, which goes to the state and they compile into a federal report. And I felt for years when I first took this position that our report was always just a copy paste from the year before as far as what we were doing. We weren't meeting our measures, and it's basically, okay, we're not doing as good as we can, we'll try harder, and here's what we're going to do to try harder. So there really wasn't a lot of accountability, there really wasn't a lot of follow-up, there really wasn't a lot of dissection of, well, how do we actually move this needle, how do we make these numbers better? And one of the areas that has always been a struggle in higher education is completions of degrees or certifications of Black male students. And that's something that I've been working very closely with a couple of different groups on campus to try to really focus on. And I was really excited last year to see that our student enrollment for the first time ever was over 50% minority. So our white students were actually like 49.2% that year. And actually this year they're down, the gap is kind of growing a little more. We were down to 47% white students this year. So I was very excited to bring that forward to our board and talk with them about the great job that we were doing about getting the minority students in the door. And then we were going to focus on those completion rates, because in the world of higher education, that's the focus. The focus is not the butts in the seats. The focus is the people actually completing the degrees. And last year, our completions on Black male students increased by 40% over the 2 years previously. And to me, that was a huge, huge accomplishment. Literally, as soon as I got those numbers, I ran down the hall and was talking with some of my colleagues about like, wow, I can't, we need to scream this from the mountaintops. Something we're doing is working. Now we just have to figure out what, which piece it is that's working. And I was met initially with, well, before you go sharing that data, you might want to double check it just to make sure it's right. And then the second piece I was hit with was, well, it was probably just making up from Hurricane Irma 2 years ago when we had a lot of students that didn't complete. So it was one of those moments where I was so excited and I was so happy to see that we were kind of moving things in a good direction. But yet when I was taking that good news out there and sharing it, I felt like I was kind of being pushed back into the corner and like, well, let's not tell the board about this until we're really sure that this is the way things are. So luckily, because we did our board meeting virtually this past time when I was getting that approved, I made sure that I wove that statistic in there. I didn't care where it came from. It was working, and we've been trying to do some good things, and I believe it's a direct result of some of those things. And then with this bringing forward the social justice issues over the summer, it really got some of our other people talking. That's where they come into what the community can do to help. So this really got a lot of our professors talking about what can we do institutionally. And I jumped onto a number of those faculty calls that they were having to talk about the issues. And in that conversation, I was able to plant my cohort model dream idea. I use the word cohort because education people love that word, and it's something they relate to, but really talking about how this cohort model can work in higher education with increasing the completion rates on the students who are having some more challenges. And then what we do is once that's solidified, then we take that down into the K through 12 world, and we start talking to the high schools about, hey, we have these great programs that are built so that these particular students can be successful, and then hopefully transition them into FSW and then into FGCU, just as the world has intended. But we're getting there. It's baby steps. So talking about what the community can do to help. When we go to the next slide, a lot of this comes from, we've started to have conversations in the past couple of months that maybe a year ago weren't being had. And that is fantastic. I hope those conversations continue. It's very important, whether we're talking about COVID, whether we're talking about fears of coming on campus, whether we're talking about fears of racial issues, social injustice. It's really important that we're listening and that we're giving grace as much as we can, that we're acknowledging that not everybody's going to be at the same place that we might be. And sometimes just somebody being brave enough to start having that conversation is them just opening the door a little bit. And instead of slamming that door shut and trying to explain things away, it's very important to listen, not try to necessarily solve the problem for them, but help them resolve it, help them come to their own conclusions of where things need to go. Because when people have buy-in with the process of how to move forward and fix something or how to resolve a problem, it tends to have a little more, it tends to grab hold and be more effective. So we help with leading with them to a resolution by asking them, what do they think would work? What are some of their ideas? What have they already tried? Because we don't want to be recommending that somebody try something that they've, none of us likes when we go to our boss with a problem and the first thing they say is what you've already been, trying to do and it's not working. As we go to the next slide, I think a lot of it starts too with acknowledgement, because sometimes people just want to be heard. They want to get the words out. They want somebody to acknowledge that, yes, this is a problem. I see you. I hear you. Not always looking for you to solve the problems of the world for them, but at least coming alongside somebody and partnering with them and being engaged with them. And we talk about being an engaged bystander when we're talking about seeing things that are not, that we think aren't okay going on. I think it's the same thing in being an engaged bystander. When you see behavior happening that's not okay, even if it's not impacting you, being the person that's strong enough to say, hey, that's really not cool. You shouldn't be talking like that. Or that's, if somebody makes a racial slur or a microaggression toward Precious, for me to be able to stand and say, like, seriously, you don't talk to people like that. That's, I can't believe you just said that. It really does go a long way in making people feel like their challenges, their heartburns, the things that concern them are being heard. Some people aren't comfortable doing that in the moment, and that's okay as well. Sometimes it could be following up with that person afterward to say, oh my gosh, I saw what happened in that meeting. That was so not cool. Are you okay? Sometimes just following up and asking those follow-up questions can open that door. And then offering, if they're not okay and they're getting all fired up, well, what can I take you to, try to report this, or what are the next steps that need, so that you're not just leaving them there by themselves, you're being that active ally. And as we go to the next slide, it talks about, what being an active ally is. So maybe you're not a member of this, the protected class that you are wanting to advocate for, wanting to stand up for and be an ally. That doesn't mean that you can't make a difference, that you can't be involved. And so to be an active ally is to be present and insert yourself, stand up for and show support for these underrepresented groups, as opposed to being that performative ally or, somebody that's really just kind of regurgitating or resharing of things that really haven't been researched and they're not exactly right, and you're not really helping any cause, you're not helping move things forward in a positive direction. Those are just a couple of the things that you can do in person. You can follow up with someone afterwards. We talk a lot in the safety world as far as if you see something, say something. That's been drilled into our heads constantly with, things that we see at airports. If you see a bag sitting off to the side, make sure you report it. We all know to do that. And I often show in my presentations, sometimes I will even bring a crazy bag with wires coming out of it. And I ask people, if you walked into this classroom and you saw this suspicious package sitting here, what would you do? And often the answer is, oh, well, I would run out of the room screaming, or I would call public safety. And then my next question is, well, why? And it's usually, well, because it could blow up, but it could damage the building and it could kill people. Perfect. That is the exact right answer. You see a suspicious package, you see something that's not right, you notify the proper people because it could cause harm. And then I turn it around when we're talking about things like relationship violence, when we're talking about things like microaggressions, when we're talking about things like systemic racism. When you see those things, you also need to have that same courage, that same sense of urgency, because those things can be just as damaging, just as critical to an institution, to an organization, as that suspicious package can. So we really need to kind of change our mindset and change that frame of mind with how we you know, being okay with saying, hey, this is not okay, this is not right, when we come across something that we feel is not okay. I think on to the next slide, I think we're going to open up for some questions if there's anything. But I want to thank you all again for letting us share some of this information with you. And we would be happy to entertain any questions anybody might have.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So you talked about your increase in your outcomes for Black males completing programs at FSW. I'm really curious, have you identified or can you tell us some of the things that you changed that may be contributing to that?
So we were a little bit deliberate with trying to put certain smaller groups together and kind of move them forward. And that's when I talk about the cohort model. We've kind of unofficially done it in one of our areas, and that's what we want to try to move forward now, especially that I've got more faculty buy-in. So what we were looking at is, you know, all of our incoming students have to take a cornerstone class. I think it's like SLS 1515. It's basically like college life skills. So the thought process is you have a like group of people, and with this instance, we will be using Black males. So we have a group of Black males that all take that course together. The course is taught by a Black male professor, and then they have peer mentors in those classes, and we would make sure that the peer mentor that would be in that class would also be a Black male. So the thought process behind it was kind of building that sense of family, that sense of belonging, and then also allowing those students to see like, hey, here's a student like me who is a couple years ahead of me, and wow, this is what they're doing. And then even beyond that, hey, here's this professor who's in front of me, and they look like me. Maybe our background isn't the same. Maybe I don't see myself being a college professor, but look, they're successful. And so then we take that and we also move it into our Comp 1, our ENC 1101, our Comp 2, some of the basic math courses. So some of those basic courses that pretty much anybody coming into a college situation, regardless of what your major is going to end up being in the long run, those basic core general ed classes, trying to keep that group together and move them forward. The thought process is the longer you can keep them together and moving forward, the stronger bond that they will have, and then the more likely they are going to be to complete, because not only are they going to they're going to have that support, but then if one of them maybe checks out for a little while, then you've got other ones that are probably going to come in around them to be like, hey man, what's going on? Why weren't you in class this week? You know, hey, I'll give you my notes, let's get caught up. To try to kind of build that camaraderie. So we think that's what we were seeing in this group that we've tried it with. And that's what we want to do long term, is we want to build that out even more and get more support and buy-in with that. We're talking about doing that with a group of veterans as well. Like I said, there's so many different ways that you could apply this. But then once we have that success built in and we have that plan, then we can take that back to our high schools, especially our high schools that have large amounts of those underrepresented groups, and we can show them data to say, hey, listen, this is what we've done. This is where we are successful. Come alongside us and let us help you reach these goals. And so hopefully it can help be a recruiting and enrollment tool, because we know the students are here. We just need to get them into the college, into the university, into the classrooms, and being successful. We provide so much support and resources and follow-up and hands-on with a first semester with a student. And then second semester, it's like completely hands-off. So if you were to look at the data, the GPAs of students first semester versus second semester, you're going to see a big drop. And we tend to lose students after our second semester. That's typically our stop out. If we can get them successfully through the second semester, we're getting them to enroll for a third semester. And that's kind of the trick where we need to kind of get that second semester to third semester so we can get them to the end.
Yeah, so that is such a fantastic example. I had no idea that this was happening at FSW. So
It's
thank you.
covert. It's covert. It's
I got
unofficial.
that. Yeah, I got that message. Now this is the kind of thing that I kind of latch onto and run with. So thanks for letting me in on the secret. But you know, I think that is exactly the type of sort of systems change that we're talking about with FutureMakers, that I think can really change the outcomes for students, and being willing and able to pilot and try things actively to move the needle is just really commendable. So thank you for sharing that. And then I'm curious, do you and Precious share those sorts of things with each other, or is there a mechanism for FSW and FGCU to sort of share success stories like that so there can be some replication there as well?
Yeah, I mean, for certain, and in terms of one of the programs that Jana kind of touched on too was the completion program, the FGCU Complete. I mean, we work very closely with FSW on that in terms of assisting students with completing their degrees. And so, yeah, I mean, Jana and I actually, we have a good personal and professional relationship. So we link up often to not only vent to each other, but to also bounce ideas, and we present together often on these issues. So yeah, we do certainly work very closely together.
Yeah. Are there any other questions from the group? I stopped sharing my screen to be able to put some links in the chat. I put the Be an Active Ally link from that one of those last slides. Also, we have another upcoming equity and COVID webinar, Where Do We Go From Here for Racial Justice? And that's a follow-up from our Fostering Inclusion webinar. And that one is actually designed based on feedback that we got. So we're excited to have that one on August 6th. And then lastly is a link to a survey, because we want to get your feedback. Obviously we use it because we created another session on some of the feedback before, but we like to provide that back to the presenters and sort of adapt as we go. But if you have any more questions, please either put them in the chat or go ahead and speak up. We'd love to hear from you. Okay. Well, I guess there are no questions. So I just want to thank you so much. And please thank you so much for bearing with me on those technical difficulties that I found out about literally as we were starting. So I appreciate everyone's patience. I definitely wanted to be able to showcase what you two had to say. I appreciate everything you do in higher ed and for our communities. It's really important. And I'm so thankful that you're willing to share with us today. And so with that, we'll sign off, and we'll have the recording available too. If anybody wants to send this information along to others, we'll get that up ASAP. So thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.